July 25th, 1944. St. Lo, Normandy. The earth itself seemed to scream. For 3 hours, wave after wave of American bombers darkened the summer sky over the hedgerow country of western Normandy. The sound was not merely heard, it was felt, a physical force that pressed against the chest, that turned the air into something solid and suffocating. Beneath this canopy of thunder, German soldiers of the Panzerlehr Division huddled in their foxholes and bunkers, praying to survive what would become the most concentrated aerial bombardment in tactical military history. Over 1,500 heavy bombers and 400 medium bombers dropped more than 4,000 tons of high explosives onto a rectangular killing zone measuring just 5 miles by 1.5 miles. When the last aircraft finally turned for home and the dust began to settle, the landscape had been transformed into something from another world, a moonscape of craters and shattered earth where hedgerows had stood for centuries. In the eerie silence that followed, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the crackling of small fires, the German commanders who had boasted of holding Normandy indefinitely began to understand that they were facing something fundamentally different from anything they had encountered in Poland, France, or Russia. This was Operation Cobra, and it would shatter not only the German defensive line, but the confidence of the Wehrmacht's most experienced commanders. For 7 weeks, the Allied armies had been locked in the Norman hedgerows, bleeding themselves against a determined enemy who knew how to use the ancient bocage terrain to maximum advantage. Every field became a fortress, every sunken lane a killing ground. The Americans and British had advanced mere miles at terrible cost, and Adolf Hitler himself had declared that Normandy would be the graveyard of Allied hopes. But what the German High Command did not yet fully comprehend, what they would learn with devastating clarity in the days to come, was that the industrial and military power arrayed against them was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Americans were not simply another army. They represented an entirely different philosophy of warfare, one built upon overwhelming material superiority, mechanical mobility, and an almost incomprehensible abundance of resources. When the American armored divisions broke out of the Normandy pocket in late July and early August of 1944, the German Field Marshals and generals who witnessed this breakout would speak words of astonishment, despair, and grudging admiration that revealed the psychological as well as military defeat of the Wehrmacht in the West. To understand what these commanders said, and why their words carried such weight, one must first appreciate what they had expected from the Americans. The German officer corps in 1944 still operated within a framework of assumptions forged in earlier campaigns. They had crushed France in 6 weeks in 1940. They had driven British forces from the continent at Dunkirk. They had conquered Yugoslavia in 11 days and Greece in 3 weeks. Even after the catastrophe of Stalingrad and the grinding retreat on the Eastern Front, the professional German military establishment retained a fundamental confidence in their superiority as soldiers. They believed in the quality of their training, the excellence of their tactics, and the fighting spirit of the Wehrmacht. They viewed the Americans specifically through a lens of skepticism shaped by propaganda and limited experience. The United States, they had been told, was a mongrel nation of capitalists and gangsters, soft from prosperity, divided by racial tensions, and lacking the martial spirit necessary for sustained combat. American soldiers, according to this narrative, might possess numerical advantage and industrial wealth, but they would crack under pressure from determined, battle-hardened German troops. This assessment was not purely propaganda. It contained threads of logic based on historical precedent and operational reality. In the First World War, American forces had arrived late and fought in relatively limited engagements. In North Africa and Italy, American units had shown themselves capable but had also suffered notable setbacks: the defeat at Kasserine Pass, the grinding stalemate at Anzio. The German command knew the Americans were well equipped, but equipment alone had never won wars. The Italians had possessed modern weapons and still collapsed. The French had fielded impressive armor in 1940 and still been routed. What mattered, in the German military philosophy, was the quality of leadership, the cohesion of units under stress, and the willingness to endure hardship. These were areas where the Wehrmacht considered itself superior to any potential opponent, the Soviets accepted only because of their sheer numerical mass and fanatical political commissars. But the hedgerows of Normandy had begun to chip away at these assumptions even before Operation Cobra. For 7 weeks, American infantry divisions had demonstrated a stubborn tenacity that surprised German defenders. The fighting had been brutal, close-quarters combat that favored experience over equipment, yet the Americans kept coming. More disturbing still was the indirect fire support that American units could call upon. German commanders noted with alarm that American artillery seemed unlimited. Where a German battalion might receive a few minutes of preparatory fire before an attack, American infantry could request and receive rolling barrages that lasted hours. Forward observers seemed to have direct lines to an inexhaustible supply of shells. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, had already experienced this phenomenon. His division, one of the Wehrmacht's most elite armored formations, had been systematically pounded to pieces by American artillery during the approach to St. Lo. In one engagement alone, his headquarters received over 3,000 artillery rounds in a 90-minute period. This was warfare by mathematics, warfare by industrial production, and it was profoundly demoralizing. Still, even as the Americans inched forward through June and July, the German commanders believed they could contain the Allied lodgment. The terrain favored defense. The hedgerows, ancient earthen banks topped with thick vegetation that divided Normandy into countless small enclosures, created a landscape where mechanized warfare became difficult and armor superiority meant little. A single determined squad with a machine gun and Panzerfaust could hold up an entire company in this terrain. The Germans fought with practiced efficiency, conducting local counterattacks, shifting reserves to threatened sectors, and generally making the Americans pay in blood for every field and crossroads. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who had replaced Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West in early July, reported to Berlin that while the situation was serious, it remained controllable. The key was to prevent a breakout. As long as the Allies remained penned in the Bocage country, their material advantages counted for less. Time, he argued, was still on Germany's side. Perhaps the Western Allies would grow weary of casualties. Perhaps political divisions would emerge. Perhaps the wonder weapons being developed in Germany, the V-weapons, the jet aircraft, would turn the tide. These hopes evaporated in the dust and fire of Operation Cobra. The breakout that followed the massive bombing on July 25th was unlike anything the German military had prepared for or believed possible. After the preliminary bombardment, American infantry divisions punched through the shattered German lines. Behind them came the armor, not piecemeal, not cautiously, but in massive, coordinated columns that exploited every gap and pressed every advantage. The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, along with the 4th and 6th Armored Divisions, poured through the breach like water through a broken dam. What made this advance so shocking was not merely its speed, but its scale and coordination. The Americans advanced with entire divisions moving in column, supported by tactical aircraft that seemed to fill the sky, refueled by an endless stream of supply trucks, and directed by a command structure that could coordinate operations across dozens of miles. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Eberbach, commanding Panzergroup West, watched in mounting disbelief as his carefully prepared defensive positions simply ceased to exist as coherent entities. German units found themselves bypassed, surrounded, or simply overwhelmed by the speed of the American advance. What was most disturbing to the professional German officers was not that they were being defeated. They had experienced defeat before on the Eastern Front, but the manner of this defeat. The Americans were fighting a different kind of war, one that seemed to operate by different rules entirely. Where German armored doctrine emphasized concentration of force at decisive points, Aggressive tactics and individual initiative, the American approach emphasized overwhelming firepower, systematic coordination, and an almost mechanical efficiency. It was as if they were not fighting a battle but solving a logistical problem, and the answer to every German defensive position was simply to apply more resources until the position ceased to exist. The German field marshals and generals began to speak among themselves and in their reports with a mixture of professional assessment and stunned recognition. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, a veteran of the Eastern Front and France, sent a report to Hitler's headquarters on July 31st, 6 days after the Cobra breakout began. His language was careful. Hitler did not tolerate defeatism, but his meaning was clear. He described the American material superiority as simply crushing and noted that German units were being bled white, not through tactical defeat but through attrition by firepower. He observed that American commanders seemed willing to spend ammunition and air support with an abandon that would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht. Where a German commander might husband his artillery ammunition for critical moments, American artillery fired almost continuously. Von Kluge's reports from this period contain a recurring theme: the impossibility of conducting mobile warfare against an enemy who possessed total air superiority and seemingly infinite supplies. But it was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel who had perhaps understood the Americans most clearly, and his observations, made before he was seriously wounded in an air attack on July 17th, would prove prophetic. Rommel had fought the Americans in North Africa and had studied their methods carefully. In his assessment to von Rundstedt and ultimately to Hitler, he had warned that the Americans represented a fundamentally different kind of adversary. They were, he noted, not better soldiers individually than the British or Germans, but they operated within a system that made individual superiority irrelevant. American doctrine, Rommel observed, did not rely on the tactical brilliance of individual commanders or the elan of assault troops. Instead, it relied on industrial processes applied to warfare. American units attacked according to standardized procedures, supported by standardized fire plans, and sustained by standardized logistics. When an attack failed, they did not necessarily maneuver cleverly to find a weak point. They simply repeated the attack with more resources until it succeeded. This approach, Rommel warned, was almost impossible to defend against indefinitely because it did not depend on capturing specific objectives or achieving specific breakthroughs. It simply ground down the defender through cumulative pressure. Rommel's most famous observation about the Americans came in a letter to his wife written in June 1944, shortly after the Normandy invasion. He described watching American supply ships unloading on the beaches and the endless columns of trucks moving supplies forward. "The enemy's air superiority has a very grave effect on our movements," he wrote, but it was the logistics that truly impressed him. He noted that American units seemed to possess 3 or 4 times the vehicles of equivalent German formations. Every American soldier, he observed, seemed to have access to motorized transport. The Americans did not march to battle, they rode. Their artillery moved by truck, their supplies arrived by truck, and their wounded evacuated by truck or ambulance. This mobility, combined with air superiority, meant that American forces could concentrate overwhelming strength at chosen points faster than German reserves could respond. As the breakout accelerated in early August, the observations of German commanders became more urgent and more revealing. General der Panzertruppen Hans von Funk, whose Alvin Panzer Corps was tasked with containing the American advance near Avranches, reported a situation that bordered on chaos. American armored columns were moving 50, 60, sometimes 70 miles in a single day, speeds that seemed impossible for large formations. Von Funk noted bitterly that his panzer divisions, once the terror of Europe, were being systematically destroyed not in climactic tank battles, but through a combination of air attack, artillery bombardment, and simple fuel starvation. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to have unlimited fuel. Their tanks advanced, refueled from following trucks, and advanced again without pause. The American logistics system, von Funk observed, was itself a weapon of war more potent than any tank or artillery piece. The contrast between expectation and reality reached its apex as August progressed and the Falaise pocket began to form. Hitler, against the advice of his field commanders, ordered a major counterattack at Mortain, designed to cut off the American spearheads and restore the defensive line. This operation, code-named Lüttich, represented Hitler's belief that aggressive willpower and tactical audacity could still overcome material disadvantage. He assembled what remained of Germany's armored reserves in Normandy, elements of 4 panzer divisions, and ordered them to drive west to the coast, splitting the American armies. The attack began on August 7th under cover of early morning fog. For a few hours it seemed possible that German armor might achieve something resembling its old success. Panzer columns penetrated several miles, surprising American positions. But then the fog lifted, and the full weight of American air power fell upon the German columns. Fighter bombers from the 19th Tactical Air Command filled the sky, thunderbolts and lightnings that attacked in relays, rockets and bombs turning the narrow Norman roads into graveyards of burning vehicles. German tanks, forced by the terrain to advance along predictable routes, were picked off one by one. The attack stalled within hours, not through American ground action, but through complete air dominance. What Hitler had envisioned as a decisive armored thrust became instead a final demonstration of how thoroughly the Americans controlled the battlefield. It was in the aftermath of Mortain that some of the most revealing German assessments emerged. SS Brigadeführer Kurt Meyer, one of the youngest divisional commanders in the Wehrmacht and a convinced Nazi, made observations that were particularly striking given his ideological background. Meyer, who commanded the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, was no defeatist. His division had fought with fanatical intensity throughout the Normandy campaign. Yet even Meyer was forced to acknowledge realities that contradicted everything the Nazi propaganda machine had promised. In his later memoir, Meyer described watching American supply columns moving forward. The roads were black with vehicles. Every few hundred meters, another convoy. He noted that American units maintained their offensive capability even after heavy casualties because replacement personnel, equipment, and supplies arrived within days. German units, by contrast, once depleted, remained depleted. The psychological impact on German commanders went beyond mere recognition of material inferiority. It represented a fundamental challenge to their understanding of warfare and their place in military history. These were men who had studied Clausewitz and Moltke, who had believed that superior training, doctrine, and fighting spirit could overcome numerical disadvantages. They had seen this principle validated in Poland, France, and the early years in Russia. Now they were learning that there existed a point where quantitative superiority became qualitative transformation. The Americans were not simply bringing more tanks and guns to battle. They were waging a different kind of war entirely, one where industrial capacity and organizational efficiency mattered more than individual courage or tactical brilliance. Field Marshal Walter Model, who replaced von Kluge in mid-August after the latter fell under suspicion for the July 20th bomb plot against Hitler, arrived in Normandy to find a situation beyond salvage. Model was known as Hitler's fireman, the general called upon to stabilize desperate situations on the Eastern Front. He had performed miracles of improvisation in Russia, cobbling together effective defenses from shattered units through sheer force of personality and tactical skill. But Normandy was different. Model toured the front lines and spoke with his commanders, and what he heard clearly disturbed him. In his reports to OKW, the German Armed Forces High Command, Model's language revealed a commander struggling to reconcile professional assessment with ideological necessity. He could not tell Hitler that the situation was hopeless, but he could and did emphasize the overwhelming material factors. Model noted that German units were outnumbered in armor by ratios of 5 or 6 to 1, in artillery by 10 to 1, and in aircraft by factors that made comparison meaningless. One particular object came to symbolize the American abundance in the minds of German soldiers and commanders alike: the jerry can. This simple 5-gallon fuel container, which the Americans had ironically copied from German designs and then manufactured by the millions, represented everything that separated American logistics from German improvisation. German troops in Normandy were constantly short of fuel. Panzer divisions remained immobile for days, waiting for fuel deliveries that never came or arrived in insufficient quantities. Supply convoys were destroyed by air attack. Fuel dumps were captured. The German war machine, so dependent on mechanized mobility, found itself increasingly paralyzed, not by lack of vehicles, but by lack of fuel to run them. The Americans, by contrast, moved fuel forward in a ceaseless stream. Every American armored column was followed by trucks carrying jerry cans. Every supply dump bulged with fuel stocks. When German reconnaissance units overran American supply points, which happened occasionally in the chaos of the breakout, they found stockpiles that seemed incredible. One German after-action report from the 2nd Panzer Division described capturing an American fuel dump near Rundstedt that contained more gasoline than the entire division had received in the previous month. The report's author noted with bitter irony that this was merely a forward supply point for a single American armored division, not even a major depot. The jerry can became a tangible symbol of American abundance, a 5-gallon reminder that the United States could not only manufacture war material in vast quantities, but could deliver it to the front lines faster than it could be consumed. Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, the father of German panzer warfare, was not directly involved in the Normandy campaign. He served as Inspector General of Armored Forces, but his assessment of American armored operations in France revealed the evolution of German thinking. Guderian had pioneered the blitzkrieg tactics that devastated Poland and France. His doctrine emphasized speed, surprise, and concentration of armored forces to achieve breakthrough and exploitation. When he examined reports of American armored operations in the breakout from Normandy, he was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Americans, he observed, did not fight like German panzers. They did not seek elegant maneuvers or concentrate overwhelming force at single decisive points. Instead, they advanced on broad fronts, maintaining constant pressure across entire sectors. Their armor did not lead in dramatic spearheads, but operated as part of combined arms teams that integrated infantry, artillery, air support, and engineers. It was methodical rather than brilliant, systematic rather than inspired, and it was devastatingly effective. In a meeting with Hitler in August 1944, Guderian reportedly made an observation that encapsulated the German command's growing understanding. He noted that German panzer tactics had been developed to compensate for Germany's lack of resources. Speed and maneuver were necessary because Germany could not afford to fight attritional battles. The Americans, Guderian observed, suffered no such constraints. They could afford to be methodical because they had the resources to sustain methodical operations indefinitely. They did not need brilliant breakthroughs because they could achieve the same results through cumulative pressure. As August 1944 progressed and the Falaise pocket closed around the remnants of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, the observations of German commanders took on an increasingly desperate quality. They were not simply reporting tactical defeats, but attempting to explain a comprehensive collapse that seemed to violate the fundamental principles by which they understood warfare. General der Infanterie Hans von Obstfelder, commanding LX-6 Corps, filed a report that was remarkable for its candor. He described American operations as possessing a machine-like quality that made conventional defensive tactics nearly useless. Every German position, von Obstfelder noted, faced the same sequence. First, aerial reconnaissance located the position. Then, fighter bombers attacked it. Then, artillery saturated it. Finally, infantry and armor assaulted what remained. This sequence repeated with mechanical regularity, regardless of how well the German troops fought. Individual courage or tactical skill could not alter the outcome, only delay it slightly. Von Obstfelder's report contained a passage that would later become famous among military historians studying the Normandy campaign. He wrote, "The American soldier is not a better fighter than our men. In close combat, man to man, our troops often prove superior. But the American is never alone. He fights with his artillery behind him, his aircraft above him, his supplies assured, and his reinforcements on the way. He advances not because he is braver, but because he is supported by a system that makes his individual limitations irrelevant." The closing of the Falaise pocket in late August provided a final devastating lesson for those German commanders who survived to analyze it. Trapped in a shrinking perimeter, subjected to constant air attack and artillery bombardment, the German forces attempted a breakout. Many succeeded in escaping the encirclement, but at terrible cost. The roads leading east from Falaise became corridors of death, littered with destroyed vehicles, dead horses, and abandoned equipment. Allied fighter bombers operated in relays, attacking anything that moved. The slaughter was so intense that even Allied soldiers who came upon the scene afterward were shocked by the scale of destruction. SS Obersturmbannführer Max Wünsche, who fought his way out of the pocket with the remnants of the 12th SS Panzer Division, later described the experience in terms that revealed how completely the Americans had dominated not just the tactical, but the psychological battlefield. "We had fought the Russians for years," Wünsche recounted, "and we knew how to survive against overwhelming numbers. But this was different. The Americans did not throw masses of men at us. They did not need to. They simply made it impossible for us to exist on the battlefield. We could not move without being attacked from the air. We could not concentrate without being shelled. We could not retreat faster than they could advance." Perhaps the most psychologically revealing assessments came from the German Field Marshals, who were compelled to explain the Normandy disaster to Hitler. These men faced an impossible task. Hitler refused to acknowledge that Germany could be outfought, or that American military capabilities exceeded German ones. Any suggestion of fundamental American superiority was dismissed as defeatism. Yet the Field Marshals could not simply lie about the scale of the defeat. Their solution was to emphasize material factors while avoiding any suggestion that American fighting quality exceeded that of German troops. Field Marshal Model, in his final reports before the remnants of German forces in Normandy retreated across the Seine, walked this tightrope carefully. He stressed that German units had fought with maximum courage and skill. He emphasized the impossible material odds. He noted the complete American air superiority. What he could not say, but what permeated every line of his reports, was that the Wehrmacht in the West had been comprehensively defeated not through any single tactical failure, but through a systematic superiority that operated at every level of warfare. The transformation in German command assessment of American capabilities between June and September 1944 was profound. Before D-Day, German commanders had viewed the Americans as well-equipped but fundamentally soft, lacking the fighting spirit necessary for sustained combat. After the Normandy breakout, this assessment lay in ruins. The Americans had demonstrated not just material superiority, but operational competence, tactical flexibility, and a capacity for sustained offensive operations that exceeded anything the Germans had anticipated. More disturbing still, the Americans had shown that they could absorb casualties, far higher casualties than the Germans initially believed American society would tolerate, and continue offensive operations without pause. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who had been relieved of command in early July, but would be reinstated in September, provided perhaps the most comprehensive assessment of what had occurred in Normandy. In a post-war interrogation, von Rundstedt reflected on the American performance with the perspective of one who had fought against France in 1940, Britain in 1940, and the Soviet Union from 1941 onward. He observed that each of these enemies had possessed certain advantages. The French had good equipment, but poor morale and leadership. The British had determination but limited resources. The Soviets had numbers but initially lacked military competence. The Americans, von Rundstedt noted, combined advantages in a way that made them uniquely formidable. They possessed both material abundance and growing tactical competence. They had the industrial capacity of the Soviets without their doctrinal rigidity, and the fighting spirit of the British without their resource limitations. Von Rundstedt's most striking observation concerned American learning capacity. He noted that American units in North Africa had been tactically naive, making errors that German units exploited. American units in Italy had been better, but still showed weaknesses. American units in Normandy, however, had demonstrated a capacity to learn from experience and adapt their tactics with remarkable speed. This capacity for institutional learning, combined with unlimited resources, created an opponent that improved continuously while the Wehrmacht could only decline. The symbolic weight of American material abundance appeared throughout German accounts of the Normandy breakout. Beyond the ubiquitous jerry can, German soldiers noted other markers of American plenty that stood in stark contrast to their own situation. Captured American rations, canned meat, chocolate bars, cigarettes, revealed a standard of supply that seemed almost insulting. German troops were surviving on diminishing rations, often going hungry, while every American soldier seemed to carry what amounted to luxuries. One German officer, in a letter intercepted by Allied intelligence, described American supply dumps with a tone of disbelief. They waste more than we possess. Food lies in piles, fuel in drums stacked higher than a house, ammunition boxes stretching to the horizon. This abundance was not merely about comfort. It was a weapon in itself. Well-fed, well-supplied soldiers fought better and longer. Vehicles that never lacked fuel could maintain operational tempo indefinitely. Artillery that never worried about ammunition conservation could fire preparatory barrages that lasted hours. The material abundance of the American military translated directly into combat power in ways that transcended simple accounting of tanks and guns. It represented a different philosophy of warfare, one that assumed resources would never be the limiting factor in military operations. The sound that came to symbolize American military power in the ears of German commanders was not the crack of rifle fire or even the roar of tank engines. It was the constant drone of aircraft overhead. Every German account of the Normandy fighting mentions this sound, describing it variously as a hum, a buzz, a roar that never ceased. Day and night, American and British aircraft controlled the sky. They flew reconnaissance missions, directing artillery fire with precision. They flew interdiction missions, destroying German supply columns and rail lines. They flew close air support missions, appearing within minutes when ground forces requested assistance. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of German military innovation, was almost entirely absent from the Normandy battlefield. German soldiers came to dread clear weather because it meant maximum air activity. They learned to move only at night or in fog, to camouflage everything obsessively, to freeze at the sound of approaching aircraft. For German commanders raised in a tradition that emphasized offensive action and seizing the initiative, this helplessness in the face of air superiority was psychologically devastating. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, one of the most successful German commanders of the war, observed in his memoirs that air superiority fundamentally altered the nature of military operations. Without air cover, Kesselring wrote, the best armored divisions become nearly useless. Without air superiority, offensive operations become almost impossible. The German generals who fought in Normandy and survived would carry the memory of American material power for the rest of their lives. In post-war years, when many wrote memoirs or participated in historical studies, the Normandy breakout featured prominently as the moment when the fundamental imbalance between Germany and the Allied coalition became undeniable. These accounts often contained a defensive quality, emphasizing that German soldiers had fought bravely and that German tactics remained superior even in defeat. But underlying this self-justification was an acknowledgement that courage and tactical skill alone could not overcome the systematic superiority the Americans demonstrated. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, whose Panzer Lehr division was effectively destroyed during Operation Cobra, provided one of the most detailed post-war assessments of American military capabilities. Army historians, Bayerlein was asked why German forces, which had proven so effective in earlier campaigns, could not contain the American breakout. His answer was revealing. "You cannot understand what it was like. You cannot imagine what it means to be bombed for 3 hours continuously, to have your communications destroyed, your headquarters buried, your men driven mad or killed or simply vanished. And then, before you can even begin to reorganize, the tanks come. Not one tank, not 10 tanks, but hundreds of tanks. And behind them, trucks. More trucks than I had ever seen. Trucks carrying infantry, trucks carrying supplies, trucks carrying fuel, trucks carrying ammunition. And all the time, your aircraft overhead. Always your aircraft. We could not move, could not concentrate, could not even retreat effectively." The transformation in German command assessment extended beyond tactical and operational considerations to strategic and even philosophical realms. The Wehrmacht had been built on certain assumptions about the nature of warfare. That willpower could overcome material disadvantage, that tactical skill could defeat numerical superiority, that the fighting spirit of soldiers mattered more than industrial production. Normandy challenged all of these assumptions. The Americans demonstrated that past a certain point, material superiority became overwhelming regardless of tactical skill or fighting spirit. They showed that industrial production could be translated directly into combat power. They proved that a systematic, methodical approach to warfare could defeat tactical brilliance through sheer cumulative pressure. This realization carried implications beyond the immediate military situation. For German officers steeped in a Prussian military tradition that emphasized the moral and spiritual dimensions of warfare, the American approach seemed almost mechanistic, as if war had been reduced to a problem of logistics and industrial output rather than a test of national will and military virtue. This perception was not entirely accurate. American forces demonstrated considerable tactical skill and fighting spirit in Normandy, but it reflected a genuine cultural divide in military philosophy. The Germans had always prided themselves on accomplishing more with less, on winning through superior training and doctrine. The Americans represented the opposite approach, winning through superior resources applied systematically. The words spoken by German field marshals in the aftermath of the Normandy breakout carried weight because they came from men who had devoted their lives to the military profession, who had studied warfare intensely, and who had experienced both triumph and disaster on multiple fronts. When von Rundstedt spoke of American capabilities, he did so with the authority of a commander who had defeated France. When Model analyzed American tactics, he brought perspective from the Eastern Front. When Rommel assessed American material power, he spoke as someone who had fought them in Africa and France. These were not novices offering uninformed opinions, but experienced professionals acknowledging a reality they had not anticipated and could not defeat. Their words, preserved in reports, letters, interrogations, and memoirs, provide a window into the psychological impact of the Normandy breakout on the German High Command. Beyond the immediate tactical defeat lay a deeper recognition that Germany faced an opponent against whom traditional military excellence was insufficient. The Americans had demonstrated that they could produce war materiel in quantities that made attrition irrelevant, could coordinate operations across vast spaces, could sustain offensive operations indefinitely, and could learn and adapt faster than their opponents could counter-adapt. This combination of attributes had never before existed in a single military force. The epilogue to the Normandy breakout played out across the fall and winter of 1944 as American and Allied forces drove toward the German border. The pattern established in Normandy repeated itself across France, Belgium, and Holland. German forces would establish defensive positions. American forces would apply overwhelming firepower. German positions would be overrun or bypassed. The Wehrmacht fought with desperate skill, but skill alone could not alter the trajectory. By December 1944, when Germany launched its final major offensive in the West, the Ardennes Offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, even this desperate gamble was predicated on the assumption that Germany could not win through conventional means. Hitler's plan depended on bad weather neutralizing American air superiority and on capturing American fuel supplies because Germany no longer possessed sufficient fuel stocks for sustained armored operations. The Ardennes Offensive's ultimate failure confirmed what German commanders had learned in Normandy, that American military power rested on foundations too deep and too broad to be undermined by tactical success alone. Even when German forces achieved complete surprise and initial success, even when they captured significant quantities of American supplies, even when they fought with the desperation of men who knew they faced defeat, the fundamental imbalance remained unchanged. The Americans absorbed the blow, reinforced threatened sectors, and methodically ground down the German offensive through the same combination of firepower, logistics, and coordination that had broken the Normandy defense. In the spring of 1945, as American forces crossed the Rhine and drove into the heart of Germany, some of the same Field Marshals who had fought in Normandy witnessed the final act. Field Marshal Model, surrounded in the Ruhr pocket, dissolved his Army Group B rather than surrender it. Before committing suicide in April 1945, he reportedly told his staff that he had done his duty, but that Germany's defeat had been inevitable once the Americans entered the war in full force. This was not defeatism, but recognition of a fundamental truth he had learned in Normandy and seen confirmed repeatedly thereafter, that military excellence alone could not overcome systematic industrial and organizational superiority. The legacy of what German field marshals said after the Normandy breakout extends beyond historical documentation into the realm of military theory and strategic thinking. In the post-war years, as military historians and theorists analyzed the Second World War, the German assessments of American capabilities provided crucial insights. They revealed that modern warfare had evolved beyond the traditional emphasis on tactical skill and fighting spirit. The Industrial Revolution had finally caught up with military affairs, transforming warfare into something that required not just armies, but entire economies mobilized for war. The Americans had been the first to fully embrace this reality, building a military machine that integrated industrial production, technological innovation, systematic logistics, and professional military skill into a unified whole. German commanders recognized, often explicitly, that they had been fighting not just the American army, but American industrial civilization itself. Every tank destroyed was replaced by 3 more from Detroit factories. Every aircraft shot down was replaced by 5 more from production lines that operated around the clock. Every gallon of fuel consumed was replaced by tankers that crossed the Atlantic in endless succession. This was warfare on a scale and of a type that transcended traditional military categories. The question was not whether German soldiers were braver or more skillful, in many cases they were, but whether courage and skill could overcome an opponent who possessed functionally unlimited resources and the organizational capacity to transform those resources into combat power. The answer, as the German field marshals learned in Normandy and across the battlefields of Europe, was no. There existed a point where quantitative superiority became qualitative transformation, where abundance of resources created new possibilities in warfare that no amount of tactical brilliance could counter. The Americans had crossed that threshold. They had created a military system that could sustain casualties, learn from mistakes, adapt tactics, and continue operations indefinitely. They had built logistics networks that stretched from factories in Michigan to supply dumps in Normandy without break. They had integrated air and ground operations so thoroughly that artillery and aircraft functioned as different components of a single fire support system. They had, in short, industrialized warfare in a way that made traditional military excellence necessary, but no longer sufficient for victory. The German Field Marshals' words about American military power in the aftermath of the Normandy breakout thus stand as testimony to a historical transformation. They mark the moment when these professional soldiers, men who had spent their lives studying warfare, who had commanded armies across Europe, who represented the pinnacle of traditional military expertise, confronted a form of warfare that rendered much of their expertise obsolete. It was not that everything they knew was wrong. German tactical doctrine remained sophisticated, and German soldiers continued to fight with skill and determination. But the context within which that doctrine operated had changed fundamentally. The rules of warfare, shaped by centuries of European military tradition, had been rewritten by American industrial and organizational power. This transformation resonated beyond military affairs into broader questions about the nature of power in the modern world. The German defeat in Normandy, and subsequently across Western Europe, demonstrated that national power in the industrial age depended less on martial tradition or military culture than on economic capacity and organizational efficiency. The Americans had proven that a nation that entered the war later, with a smaller standing army and less military tradition than Germany, could nonetheless create the world's most powerful military force through systematic application of industrial resources and organizational principles. This was a new kind of power, one that emerged from factories and logistics networks rather than parade grounds and military academies. The words of German commanders preserved a recognition of this shift, even as they attempted to maintain professional pride and explain defeat without admitting fundamental inferiority. When von Rundstedt spoke of American capabilities, when Model described American tactics, when Bayerlein recounted the destruction of his division, they were documenting not just military events, but a civilizational encounter. They were describing the collision between an old form of military power, based on skill, training, and fighting spirit, and a new form based on industrial capacity, systematic organization, and technological integration. That the old form fought with desperate courage and tactical excellence only made its ultimate defeat more instructive. Armored divisions broke out of Normandy revealed truths they might not have wished to acknowledge but could not avoid. They spoke of overwhelming firepower that made defensive positions untenable. They described logistics networks that enabled continuous operations regardless of distance from base. They noted air superiority so complete that ground operations became nearly impossible without it. They acknowledged learning capacity that improved American performance continuously. And underlying all these specific observations was a fundamental recognition that they had encountered a form of military power that transcended traditional categories, that integrated industrial civilization directly into warfare, and that could not be defeated by traditional military means alone. These words, preserved in reports filed under duress, letters written in defeat, and memoirs composed in the shadow of catastrophe, stand as historical evidence of the moment when American military power fully manifested itself on the European battlefield. They document not just a tactical defeat, but a strategic and psychological transformation. The German Field Marshals learned in Normandy what Japan would learn in the Pacific, and what observers worldwide would conclude, that the United States had developed a way of warfare that leveraged its unique advantages: industrial capacity, organizational efficiency, technological innovation, and vast resources into military capabilities that could overcome any opponent. The Normandy breakout was merely the most dramatic demonstration of this reality, but it was a demonstration that convinced even those most resistant to its implications. The jerry cans kept rolling forward, filled and refilled from supply networks that stretched back to American oil fields. The aircraft kept droning overhead, emerging from production lines that operated without pause. The artillery kept firing, fed by ammunition ships that crossed the Atlantic in convoys the Germans could no longer seriously threaten. And through it all, the armored divisions kept advancing, mechanical embodiments of a new form of warfare that the old military establishment could not match. The German Field Marshals understood this, even as they struggled to explain it to superiors who demanded miracles, and to themselves who had devoted lives to military excellence. Their words, reluctant acknowledgments of a new reality, echo across the decades as testimony to the transformation of warfare that occurred when American industrial civilization turned its full attention to military affairs. In the dust and fire of Normandy, an old world of warfare died, and the German field marshals were among the first to recognize and record its passing.